today we're going to be installing these Viking double adjustable coilovers into the Camaro. So if you guys remember, I have a Hotchkiss 3-inch lowering system on the car now, but I also have tubular upper and lower control arms that aren't from Hotchkiss. What I didn't realize when I ordered all the parts was that the lower control arms I got are designed to drop the car an additional 2 inches. So with 3-inch lowering springs and 2 inches of lowering from the lower control arms, obviously 5 inches is way too much on these cars. So when I put it all together, I did put a 1-inch spacer that we'll see when I pull the springs out, but it's still too low. So I wanted to go with some adjustable coilovers so that 1, I can dial in the exact ride height I want. 2, the adjustability lets me tune the car for whatever event I'm doing. So if I want to do autocross, I can stiffen them up. If I want to do drag racing, I can lower the rebound so we can kind of shift weight a little bit better, get a little bit more traction. So having them being adjustable will help us kind of tune the car based on, like I said, what we're doing. So I'm going to go ahead and get the front end of the car up in the air, pull the front wheels off, and then I'll show you kind of what I'm working with. Here's everything that comes in the kit. So we have 550-pound springs. Of course, the shocks themselves with the compression and rebound adjustments. They are set up to work with kind of a factory suspension design as far as they are going to bolt right in place of where the kind of factory shock mounts. But as far as I know, they're not really designed to work with factory lower control arms. I think the stamped steel arms are just a little bit too thin on the bottom. So they may or may not work. I don't really know exactly what they recommend if you run them on factory control arms or not. Like I said, I have aftermarket control arms that are thicker and kind of designed to run with either normal coil springs or coilover setup. So just kind of check out if you have factory control arms if they're going to work or not. We have the thrust bearing, which is an option in this kit. So what this does is acts as a bearing basically, and it goes on top of the adjuster and on the bottom of the spring, so that when you are adjusting the height, it's nice and easy to slide. It doesn't bind up at all because it's got this nice, I think they call it a thrust bushing, to help adjust it. And then we have, of course, all the hardware and everything needed, and the 2 wrenches to undo the lock ring, and then also the adjusting ring itself. So we're going to, like I said, pull the front wheel and everything off to get into the suspension, and it should be, fingers crossed, a relatively easy swap. Now that we've got the car in the air and the wheels off, we can kind of access what we need to do here. So basically the operation is pretty simple, and I'm sorry if you can't really see around this drum, but we're basically going to leave the whole upper control arm in place. This spindle is going to stay in place. We're just going to be undoing the nut off the lower ball joint so that the lower control arm can just swing down, and that's what will let our spring come out. So right now I'm going to take off the shock, which is just the 2 bolts on the bottom and the 1 on the top. That'll drop straight out of the bottom. Then we'll put a jack underneath the lower control arm to support it, undo the lower ball joint nut, and we might have to tap it or use my ball joint separator to get to unseat. And then we can lower that lower control arm out and pull out the Hotchkiss spring with that little spacer as well. All right, I got the lower ball joint undone. Basically, you pull the cotter pin out, undo the castle nut a couple of threads, then either tap on the top of the ball joint, or I use a ball joint separator to kind of unseat the taper on the ball joint. Now that part is loose, so I'm going to undo the top hardware on the sway bar so that I can allow the actual lower control arm to swing all the way down. So I'm just going to pull that off, and then we'll be ready to lower the jack and get that spring out. So mine proved to be just slightly more difficult because as of right now I'm still utilizing these stock drums. So it's very difficult to get, I know it's going to be almost impossible to see, but to actually get the whole spindle off of that bottom ball joint. So what I ended up doing is just undoing the top, and that let it kind of slide down just enough for me to be able to slide the spring out. So I haven't checked it yet, but hopefully we'll be able to get the new one in place with this setup as well. Only time will tell. What I need to do now is in here there's welded on nuts for the shock mounts. The way the Viking kit works is this T-bar will go on top of the control arm, so it needs a flat surface to mount to. So we're just going to take the grinder and grind off the little welds that hold those nuts on. so that we can use the hardware and everything that came with the Viking kit. So we'll cut those off and then we'll be ready to install the new stuff. We got the little nuts that were welded on the bottom taken off, so now we're ready to attempt to install the new shock. Before I do that, I need to kind of assemble it. So basically we have a lock ring, then the bottom, I don't know what they actually call it, but it's the one the actual spring sits on. Like I mentioned earlier, there is this thrust bearing that goes on top of here, and the spring is going to sit on top of that so it can adjust nice and easily. Before we put all this together, we're going to use some of this aluminum anti-seize and kind of put it, I'm going to put it on all of the threads from about halfway down. I don't see me having any higher than that, but I'm just going to kind of put it on the threads and then use a little brush to kind of brush it into all of the threads. You're really not supposed to get that stuff on your hands. I'm also going to put some anti-seize inside of this little bearing as well, just to make sure all that continues to kind of freely move. So if we need to make adjustments when the car is actually put back together, you know, we can use the wrench and actually get some turns on this without it binding up. So that's exactly what anti-seize is supposed to do, is kind of help lubricate it and make sure it all moves smoothly. I do have the adjustments kind of set already on the shocks. I have it set up at what they recommend for a auto cross and road handling, which is like 10 stops of compression and 14 stops of rebound. I think that'll be a good starting point. We can kind of tune from there once we get it all put back together. So I'm going to throw the anti-seize on here and then put the whole assembly together and try and put it up in the car. Basically, we're just going to repeat the process. This goes into the stock shock mount and has very similar kind of rubber isolators and everything that go on here. And then, yeah, we should be pretty good. So when we put it in the car, we're going to want to make sure that this spring, there's a little notch in the frame or in the subframe where this actually seats into. So when we install this, we want the adjustment knobs facing out and then clock this in a way that you know, seats this into that little spring pocket. If you're actually in the car, it's really easy to see what I'm talking about. We just want to make sure that's clocked the right way and then put it together. So let's do it. The new coilover is in place. Went in super easy because it's not real tall right now. We have the adjusters one thread from the very bottom. So this would theoretically be the lowest the car could possibly be. You know, we don't plan on leaving it here. That's just what we do for install. Top goes through the stock shock mount, mounts up identical to how that does. So now I just put both the ball joints in. I need to tighten down those nuts to factory specs. I have to look up what they are. I believe somewhere around like 60 foot-pounds, something like that. Then put 2 new cotter pins in. Once we have that done, we can reinstall the sway bar link and then tighten up the bottom 2 mounting bolts for the actual coilover itself. And then final step before we actually lower the car down is we want to raise that up. It recommends raising it up 1/3 of the way up the shock body as a kind of a starting point for the ride height. So we'll do that. Odds are I think I'm going to have to raise it from that point. But we'll go with what it says and do it about 1/3 of the way up. Lower the car down. Well, actually, I'll do the other side off camera. Then we'll lower the car down, see what kind of adjustments we have to make. But, yep, so now I'm just going to tighten up those 2 new cotter pins, like I said, sway bar linkage, tighten the bottom bolts, and then we'll be ready to knock out the other side real quick and go from there. Just finished up the passenger side. I have both of them, like I said, set to about 1/3 of the way on the adjustability. So I'm going to go ahead and pull it off the jack stands, lower it all the way down, kind of shake the car a little bit to try and get it to settle. And we'll see how far off we are with the height adjustment. So we'll get that dialed in and I'll show you guys how to do that, assuming we need to. And then we will bring those little lock washers or lock nuts or whatever you want to call them up to kind of lock in the height once we get it set. But this is the initial one, so we'll drop it down and see how she looks. So overall we were really close. So I believe it was 24.5 inches from the ground to the center line of the fender, which when I started before the coilovers it was at 23.5. And again, I said I wanted to raise the front an inch. So we got lucky and that's exactly what happened. On this side, it was a little bit taller, about 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch taller. So I wanted to show you what it looks like to adjust it now that the coilovers are completely on the car, because I obviously need to lower this side just a little bit for it to match. So all you have to do is lift it up enough to have the wheel off the ground. Slide under here. We have our adjuster, and then, you know, depending on if you need to raise the car or lower the car, you'll put it around this nut, you know, where the actual spring is. If I had the lock nut tightened, you'd have to obviously undo that first. But put this around here and turn it one way or another. I need to lower the car, so I need this to go down a little bit, which means I'm gonna put this on here and crank, you know, clockwise. So go ahead and do that, and we'll tweak it a little bit and see if we can get it to match the other side. All right, I got the ride height dialed in where I think I want it. I need to kind of take the car around the block and do some, you know, cornering and kind of make sure it's totally settled. And then I'm going to pull up somewhere flat and just make sure it looks the way I want, and I'm having like the kind of clearance and everything I want before it's 100% done. But I did go ahead and tighten up those lock nuts so that everything's tight and everything's good to go to drive it. One thing I am going to do right now, and I'll kind of give you the quick rundown of what I'm going to do, is a quick string alignment. So if you don't know what a string alignment is, I'm basically going to take jack stands, put them on the front, kind of right in front of each front wheel, run a piece of string from one jack stand all the way across, like through the center line of the rear wheel, across the back, through the center line of the other rear wheel, and back up to the front again. And basically what this is going to do is it's going to make us have a perfectly straight line to measure off of to see how our toe's doing. So we can't really adjust camber all that much, you know, here in the garage, or caster. So really all we're going to worry about for our street alignment is going to be toe, just to make sure we're not way off one way or another. We're going to set it probably at 0, maybe just a little bit of toe in, and then we'll be good enough to test drive it. And then I am going to get the car kind of professionally aligned once I 100% get the ride height set up. So let's knock that out real quick. Once you have the string running right through the center of your wheel, you make sure it's running through the center of your back wheel. What you want to do is just move that front jack stand until this front of the string just barely touches the tire. That way you know that this is perfectly straight and it's not coming around here and then getting bent over or anything like that. So I need to move it in just 1/8 of an inch. So literally just slide it over, and now it's just touching the tire. And we'll do the exact same thing on the driver's side. Make sure that's just barely touching the tire. Then we can make our measurements. Now that we have the string in place, we can do our measurements. We're basically just going to put the tape measure right under the string, run it to the lip of the wheel, getting right at 2.5 on that side. On the front side, 2 3/8, almost 2.5. So we're not too far out, but need to bring in the front just a little bit. So how we do that on this car is going to be kind of dark and hard to see under here, but there's the tie rods right there. So there's a lock nut on each side, and then the center of it turns. I have the upgraded Hotchkiss thicker, you know, a little bit stronger ones, but the factory adjusts the same way. Basically, you undo each side and you can turn it. So we'll turn it to where it'll push the back of the tire out a little bit, aka also pushing the front end, until our measurements match, or maybe we'll go for a 1/16 of an inch, something like that, of toe in, meaning the measurement on the front is going to be a 1/16 of an inch longer than the measurement from the back. First test drive is going great. So I think the stance is exactly where I want it to be. So if you remember before, the front fender went and just barely went over the wheel. And I think that was just a little bit too low. The tire was also getting into the fender a little bit on full lock. And then I would kind of actually got almost high centered on a couple of steep driveways and stuff. So I think it was a good move to go a little bit higher. It matches the back, which is really nice. So yeah, they feel really, really good. The rebound feels nice. It's not kind of floating around or anything. So I'm really, really happy with how they're kind of turning out. So I need to go get a professional alignment now so that we can make sure their camber and everything is all fully kind of dialed in. I'm also, let me know what you guys think. I kind of want to get a little bit of a spacer for the front wheels to kind of bring them out. Like, I think the fitment on the back wheel is perfect, but I think the fitment on the front wheel, I think it could stand to be out just a hair more. Nothing crazy, but maybe a quarter of an inch or something like that. So let me know what you guys think about that. All right, guys, that's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed the coilover install. The car is getting really, really close to being able to actually drive hard on the street and hopefully do some autocrosses and some other stuff. Like I kind of mentioned earlier in the video, we got a ton of big stuff on the way for the car. Possible drivetrain swap. Definitely going to be doing disc brakes very soon as well. So yeah, stay tuned. If this is your first video you've watched on the channel, you know, make sure to subscribe, and you can kind of see more car content. Have a lot more motorcycle content coming up very soon as well. So yeah, we'll see you guys soon.